How are you? I'm glad to meet you. Today's topic is the Israelites, 40 Years in the Wilderness. The author is Abraham Park. The 40 Years in the Wilderness, 1446 to 1406 BC, 636th-676th year of the Covenant of the Torch. Moses's age from 80 to 120. The day after the Passover in the year 1446 BC. In the 15th day of the first month, the Israelites marched out of Egypt, with an high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians. While the Egyptians mourned in terrible grief as they buried their firstborn, Numbers chapter 33 verse 3. The 40 years of the wilderness that followed the Exodus were, by the great authority of God, a period of punishment for Israel's sin of grumbling against God and refusing to enter into Canaan because of their disbelief in God's mighty power. Furthermore, it was a period of discipline so that they would be able to live as God's own people by the time they conquer Canaan. Throughout the 40 years, a countless number of Israelites endlessly rebelled against God, continuously grumbling and betraying His grace. They troubled His heart and deeply grieved Him. Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 7, Psalm 78 to 40. Nonetheless, God showed endless mercy and compassion even in the midst of His great wrath. He carried them, just as a man carries his son, guiding them all the way to the land of Canaan. Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 31, because He remembered His holy covenantal word with Abraham. Psalms 105 to 42. The Israelites' 40-year journey in the wilderness is a true example and warning. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 1. For the journey of faith by today's saints in the church in the wilderness. Acts chapter 7 verse 38. The 40-year wilderness journey condensed into Numbers 33. Bringing closure to the 40 years in the wilderness. Numbers 33 reflects on the history of the Exodus and the wilderness journey, reiterates the law, and delivers God's commands concerning the subsequent undertaking to conquer the land of Canaan. In particular, Numbers 33 records how the Israelites camped 41 times during the 40 years in the wilderness by compressing the vast journey in chronological 1. Recorded by the command of the Lord. Moses emphasized in Numbers 33 that the 41 campsites were recorded by the command of the Lord. Numbers chapter 33 verse 2, and Moses wrote their goings out according to their journeys by the commandment of the Lord. And these are their journeys according to their goings out, as Moses wrote about the wilderness journey and each of the campsites. He must have vividly recalled the endless grace of Emmanuel that God had bestowed upon His people even in the midst of their disobedience, the due wrath and judgment, His conflicts with the people, the tears He had to shed, and continuous betrayals and rebellions. Those campsites were truly places of unforgettable and everlasting memories to Moses and the people. They were places that God went ahead and found for them. Thus, Numbers chapter 10 verse 33 explains that the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, which symbolizes God's presence, journeyed in front of the people for 3 days to seek out a resting place for them. The names of the places that God Himself had selected for them may certainly imply the events that occurred in each specific place and its redemptive significance. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 10. 2. Recorded, according to their journeys. Numbers chapter 33 verse 2. And Moses recorded their starting places according to their journeys by the command of the Lord. And these are their journeys according to their starting places. Numbers 33 has 41 accounts of the phrase in Hebrew word, bisu, bayahanu, meaning, they journeyed from, and camped by. They had repeated the act of camping, packing, and marching 41 times in the wilderness. Moses recorded the places of their camps. And there are 3 reasons for recording in detail even the unfamiliar places that were never mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. First, It was to prove that the 40 years of marching in the wilderness was a historical fact. Later, the Israelites would observe the Feast of Booths in the land of Canaan, which they had conquered during the time of Joshua, in remembrance of the times when they had lived in booths, tents. Even after the Israelites returned from their captivity in Babylon, they observed the Feast of Booths by making booths and living in them. Leviticus chapter 23 verse 34, Numbers chapter 29 verses 12 to 38, Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 17. Second, it was to remind the Israelites of God's never-ending fervent love, a love that saves his people, whom he had chosen, despite their numerous failures and sins. Although they were in the wilderness, a land of death unfit for mankind to survive, God's care and protection at each and every place during those 40 years allowed them to lack no necessities. Deuteronomy chapter 2 verse 7. Indeed, this was another demonstration of God's faithful love, which fulfills what he had promised. Psalms 105-8. Third, it showed that the first generation in the wilderness could not enter Canaan because of their disbelief, thereby teaching the second generation in the wilderness that the conquest of Canaan and settlement in the land were possible only when they completely put their trust in God. Psalm chapter 78 verse 8, and not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its heart, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. 3. The camps of Israel were centered around the tabernacle. The Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, but God allowed them to be born again as hosts of God. Exodus chapter 7 verse 4. Thus, the Exodus was not a disorderly escape, but rather an orderly march carried out in martial array like an army. Exodus chapter 13 verses 18 to 19. Numbers chapter 33 verse 1. They also camped according to their divisions and marched according to their own camp. Numbers chapter 1 verse 52. According to Webster's Revised Unabridged Dictionary, the word camp means temporary living quarters specially built by the army for soldiers. Hebrew, it is mahane, meaning encampment or camp. In the very center of the camp was God's tent of meeting. Numbers chapter 2 verse 2. The Levites camped around the tent of meeting on all four sides. Numbers chapter 3 verse 21. On the east side, the sons of Moses and Aaron camped. Numbers chapter 3 verse 38. On the west side, the families of the Gershonites. Numbers chapter 3 verse 23. On the south side, the families of the sons of Kohath. Numbers 3:29. And on the north side, the families of Merari. Numbers chapter 3 verse 35. Around them were the 12 tribes of Israel, 3 tribes on each side according to their armies and standard. Numbers 2-1. Thus, the Israelites camped around God's tent of meeting, marched, and pitched tents again according to God's command to Moses. Numbers chapter 2 verse 34. The author of this content is Reverend Abraham Park. Reverend Abraham Park was an acclaimed world-class theologian with remarkable pastoral spirituality. He had dedicated his entire life to prayer and the scriptures, having read the Bible over 1,800 times. Throughout his lifetime ministry, he was a true pastor who loved the church and the congregation like his own children. His daily schedule consisted of 2-hour prayers and 3-hour Bible readings, as well as continual preaching and evangelizing. With conviction that to die is to live, he prayed deep in the mountains for 3 years, 6 months, and 7 days. When the sun set, he did nothing but pray. When the sun rose, he did nothing but read the Bible. Then, finally, a single ray of grace shone upon him. Through the powerful illumination of the Holy Spirit and by the grace of God, the scenes in the Bible unfolded like a panorama before his eyes. These scenes were written down on large arrowroot leaves which were bound with a twig. They were later transcribed onto paper bought from a village under the mountain every few months. This is how the Reverend Abraham Park's sermons began. Many people are impressed by the Reverend Abraham Park as follows. How can a person love so many people? How can a person make such a big impact to so many people? He is so hard-working, never rest. He never ceased to pray. He deserves to be truly honored for his dedication for the church and the congregations. A true and faithful worker of God.